Picture this. You're walking through what was once the beating heart of an empire. Marble columns rise like ancient sentinels around you, but they're cracked now, wrapped in ivy. The fountains that once sang with fresh mountain water are silent, filled with debris and wild grass. Forum stones that echoed with the voices of merchants, politicians, and children now host only the whisper of wind and the occasional call of nesting birds. How does a civilization simply walk away? How do cities that took centuries to build become empty in mere decades? What compels an entire population to abandon the sophisticated urban life their ancestors fought to create? Tonight, we're going to explore one of history's most haunting mysteries. Why? The proud cities of Rome. Cities that had survived barbarian raids, political upheavals, and natural disasters for hundreds of years, were quietly abandoned by their own people in the twilight of the ancient world. Was it plague that drove them out? Economic collapse? The weight of endless wars? Was it something more subtle? Slow erosion of the very idea that these stone monuments to human achievement were still home? Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. It's strangely comforting to see how many of us are drifting off together from different corners of the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe switch on a gentle fan for that soothing background hum. And let's settle in for tonight's quiet journey through history. We'll walk through the crumbling streets together, feeling the moss-covered stones beneath our feet, breathing the air that still carries whispers of Latin prayers and forgotten conversations. We'll meet the last people who called these places home, understand their daily struggles, and perhaps discover why they chose the uncertain countryside over the familiar comfort of stone walls and Roman law. So settle back, let your breathing slow, and prepare to witness the gentle end of a world. The first pale light of dawn creeps through the single window of your stone hut, and already you can feel it, that familiar weight of another day in a world that seems to be forgetting how to be Roman. You are Marcus, though most people simply call you the brickmaker now, as if your name matters less than your diminishing trade. Your calloused hands reach for the rough wool tunic draped over the wooden chest your grandfather carved, back when carving decorative flourishes into furniture still seemed worthwhile. The hearth is cold. Of course it's cold. There hasn't been proper firewood since the local forest was stripped bare 3 winters ago, first by the army, then by desperate families, and finally by anyone with an axe and enough hunger to risk the bandits that now make those woods their home. You wrap your cloak tighter around your shoulders and step outside into air that carries the scent of wood smoke from distant cooking fires, but also something else, something that smells like abandonment. Your workshop sits at what was once the prosperous edge of Narbo Martis, a Roman colonia that your great-grandfather helped build with his own bricks. The kill that feeds your family, when it feeds your family, squats like a patient beast beside your dwelling, its mouth dark and waiting. But these days, fewer and fewer people have need for bricks. No one builds anymore. They dismantle. You remember when commissioners from the city would arrive with scrolls bearing the imperial seal, ordering hundreds of bricks for new bathhouses, expanded forums, reinforced aqueducts? You remember the satisfying rhythm of those busy seasons, the careful mixing of clay and straw, the methodical shaping, the patient feeding of fires that glowed like contained suns. Your bricks helped build the infrastructure of civilization itself. Now, as you survey the slowly dissolving edges of your city, you see your own handiwork being carefully removed, brick by brick, by families who need building materials for farmhouse walls and monastery foundations in the countryside. They pay you in grain now, sometimes in preserved meat, occasionally in rough cloth woven by wives, who no longer have access to the fine fabrics that once arrived on merchant ships. The morning air carries voices fewer than it used to, and speaking languages that shift and blend in ways that would have scandalized the old grammatici. Your neighbors are a mixture now, descendants of Roman settlers like yourself, Visigothic families who arrived as federates and stayed as farmers, and a growing number of refugees from territories further north where Saxon raiders have been more persistent. You walk toward your workshop, stepping around puddles that form because the old drainage system requires maintenance no one can afford. The city council building, that proud structure with its marble columns and mosaic-decorated entrance, now serves as a shelter for displaced families. Last winter, you watched them burn the wooden furniture from the old administrative offices, piece by piece, to keep warm. The bronze fittings have long since been sold or melted down. Your kiln needs repair. Crack has been growing along its eastern wall, and without proper mortar, you've been plugging it with clay and prayers. The tools your father left you are wearing thin, and there's no longer a metal worker in the city who can forge replacements. The last one left for Tolosa 2 summers ago, claiming there was more work there, but still, you persist. Because what else is there to do? The rhythm of your days has become a meditation on making something useful from mud and fire in a world that increasingly sees both as luxuries. You dig clay from the riverbank in the early morning, when the mist still rises from the water and you can pretend the silence is peaceful rather than ominous. Your hands know this clay intimately now, its texture, its willingness to hold shape, the way it responds to different amounts of straw or sand. The mixing is where you lose yourself. Your feet work the clay with practiced efficiency, while your mind drifts to memories of busier times. You remember your wedding day, when the forum was still maintained, and your bride wore flowers in her hair as she walked past functioning fountains. You remember your children learning to read Latin from the inscriptions on public buildings. Back when those inscriptions still mattered to someone, shaping the bricks requires patience that borders on ritual. Each one must be uniform, strong enough to bear weight, smooth enough to lay properly. Your wooden molds are wearing out, but you've learned to compensate, to guide the clay with hands that have developed their own measure of precision. As you work, you often hear the distant sound of hammers and saws from the old residential district, where families are carefully dismantling houses to salvage materials for smaller, more defensible homes closer to the church. The church. That's where the heart of the community beats now, such as it is. The bishop, a learned man who speaks both Latin and the local vernacular with equal authority, has become more important than any civil magistrate. He controls the distribution of grain when shipments arrive from estates still functioning in the countryside. He mediates disputes that once would have been handled by Roman law. He performs the rituals that mark time and season and meaning in lives that have lost most of their other anchors. Your own relationship with the church is complicated. You were raised to honor the old gods alongside the new your grandfather taught. You to offer a small piece of bread to the spirits of the kill before each firing, and old habits are hard to abandon. But you attend services now. Because community matters more than theology, when the world outside your walls grows increasingly uncertain. The bishop has been kind to you, commissioning bricks for repairs to the basilica and for the construction of a new scriptorium, where monks copy manuscripts. It's steady work, though it pays in blessings and meals rather than the silver coins you remember from better days. Still, there's something satisfying about knowing your bricks will help preserve books even if you can't read most of them yourself. Afternoon brings the heat of the kill. Feeding the fire requires judgment developed over decades of practice. It's too little fuel and the bricks remain soft and crumbly. Too much and they crack or warp. You've learned to read the flames like a language, to understand the subtle differences in color and movement that indicate temperature and timing. The fuel itself has become a constant challenge, what is scarce and expensive. Sometimes you burn straw, though it requires careful attention to maintain steady heat. Occasionally, someone brings you broken furniture or damaged roof beams to burn, trading the materials for finished bricks. These transactions feel like small ceremonies of surrender, beautiful objects reduced to ash, so that new, simpler things might be built. While the kiln works, you often sit outside your workshop and watch the city change around you. The old market district empties a little more each month. Shops that once sold exotic spices and fine pottery now stand vacant, their wooden shutters weathered and broken. The only merchants who still visit regularly are those dealing in necessities grain. Iron tools, basic cloth, and occasionally books or religious artifacts for the church. Children play in the ruins of the old bathhouse now. You remember when that complex was the pride of the city, its heated pools, its exercise courts, its social chambers where citizens would spend entire afternoons discussing philosophy and politics. The roof collapsed 5 years ago, and no one had the resources to repair it. The bronze pipes were salvaged for other uses. The marble was carefully removed to decorate the church. But the children seem happy enough, chasing each other through chambers that once echoed with adult conversations about imperial policy and local gossip. Their games create new purposes for old spaces. Perhaps that's a form of continuity, even if it's not the kind anyone planned. Evening brings the quietest hours. As the sun fades behind the hills that surround your valley, You bank the fires and clean your tools with movements that have become automatic. Your wife prepares a simple meal from grain traded for bricks, vegetables from your small garden, and occasionally meat from neighbors who still keep livestock. The conversations around your hearth are different now than they were in your youth. Less discussion of imperial politics, more practical planning for the coming season. Which families are talking about leaving for the countryside? Which fields might be available for lease? How much grain should be stored against the possibility of another bad harvest? Your children, those who remain in the city, speak a Latin that would puzzle your grandfather. It carries influences from Gothic, from the local Celtic substrate, from practical necessity rather than grammatical purity. But it serves its purpose. It carries meaning, affection, instruction, prayer. Language adapts, as everything must. Sometimes in the deepest part of the night, you lie awake and listen to the silence. Once, this city hummed with constant activity carts rolling over stone streets, fountains flowing, the distant sounds of metalworking and construction and human conversation. Now the quiet is so profound that a barking dog or crying infant seems startling. The silence isn't empty, though. It's full of potential, of endings and beginnings you can't quite name. It's the sound of one world fading and another taking shape, slowly and without ceremony. In the morning, you'll rise again before dawn. You'll check the kiln, prepare the clay, shape new bricks for whatever small projects still require them. You'll trade your work for food and security and the small pleasures that make life bearable. You'll participate in the quiet transformation of everything you've known, one brick at a time. And perhaps, without realizing it, you'll be helping to build something new from the careful ruins of something very old. The rhythm of your days continues, a steady heartbeat in a world learning to breathe differently. But even as you work, even as you maintain the careful routines that give shape to uncertainty, you sense something larger shifting. The very idea of what it means to be Roman is changing, brick by brick, day by day. Your children will inherit a world that speaks Latin differently, worships differently, governs differently. They may not even call themselves Roman at all. Yet they will still need shelter. They will still need walls to keep out the wind and rain. They will still need the patient craft of shaping earth into something useful and enduring. And in that continuity, that fundamental human need for protection and permanence, something of the old world survives, even as everything else transforms. Your hands know this truth better than any philosopher or historian ever could. They know that civilizations may rise and fall, but the work of making a home, of creating something useful from raw materials, of building spaces where families can gather safely around a fire, that work continues. The clay doesn't care about imperial politics. The fire doesn't distinguish between Roman bricks and post-Roman bricks. Your craft transcends the boundaries that historians will draw between ancient and medieval, between classical and barbarian, between empire and aftermath. In the morning, you will rise before dawn. You will shape clay with hands that carry forward thousands of years of human knowledge about making shelter from earth and flame. You will participate in the oldest of human activities, the transformation of the natural world into spaces where life can flourish. However modestly, however temporarily, and perhaps that is enough. Perhaps that is how worlds end and begin, not with dramatic declarations or decisive battles, but with the quiet persistence of people who know how to make useful things from whatever materials they have at hand. The kiln glows softly in the darkness, holding its heat through the night like a banked heart. Tomorrow will bring its own challenges, its own small victories and defeats. But tonight, surrounded by the familiar tools of your trade and the gentle sounds of your sleeping family, you rest in the knowledge that you have done what you could, built what you could, preserved what you could of the techniques and wisdom passed down through generations of craftsmen who shaped the Roman world one brick at a time. Outside, the city sleeps fitfully, dreaming perhaps of its former grandeur or its uncertain future. But inside your modest dwelling, there is peace, the peace that comes from honest work completed, from useful skills maintained, from the simple satisfaction of having created something solid and enduring in a world that often feels as fragile as unfired clay. The last ember in your hearth settles with a soft whisper, and you close your eyes, knowing that dawn will come again, bringing with it the eternal rhythm of clay and fire, of making and building, of carrying forward the human capacity to create shelter and beauty from the raw materials of an indifferent earth. Your dreams, when they come, are filled with the texture of clay beneath your palms, the glow of kilns, and the satisfaction of walls that will stand long after the empires that commissioned them have faded into gentle memory. A life suspended between memory and oblivion. As the last light of another uncertain day fades across the hills of northern Gaul, let us turn our attention to a man who carried the weight of an entire world on his shoulders, a world that, by the time he inherited it, existed more in memory than in reality. His name was Syagrius, and he bore the curious distinction of being called King of the Romans in a place where Rome itself had become little more than a distant echo. Imagine, if you will, the peculiar burden of this inheritance. To wake each morning in a palace that still bore the marble inscriptions of imperial authority. To issue decrees in the name of an empire that no longer acknowledged your existence. To maintain the elaborate ceremonies of Roman governance while surrounded by the growing reality of a post-Roman world. Syagrius was born around 430 AD. In that strange twilight period, when the Western Roman Empire was neither fully alive nor completely dead. His father, Aegidius, had served as a Roman general in Gaul, one of those military commanders who found themselves governing Roman territories that had been effectively abandoned by Rome itself. It was a position that required a peculiar kind of courage, the courage to maintain faith in an ideal, even as the practical foundations of that ideal crumbled beneath one's feet. The young Syagrius grew up in Soissons, a city that still retained much of its Roman character despite being increasingly isolated from imperial control. The forums still functioned, though the merchants who gathered there increasingly spoke languages other than Latin. The bathhouses still operated, though they relied on local rather than imperial maintenance. The aqueducts still carried fresh water, though their engineering was maintained by craftsmen, who learned their skills from necessity rather than from formal Roman training. Picture him as a child, walking through streets that bore the physical imprint of centuries of Roman civilization, the precisely laid stones, the carefully planned drainage systems, the public buildings designed to inspire civic pride and imperial loyalty. Every architectural detail spoke of belonging to something larger, something permanent, something that transcended the temporary concerns of any individual lifetime. Yet even as a boy, Syagrius would have been aware of the growing strangeness of his situation. Visitors to his father's court spoke of barbarian kingdoms to the east and south, of imperial capitals that seemed impossibly distant, of political arrangements that bore little resemblance to the classical Roman model he was being educated to inherit and uphold. His tutors, learned men who had been trained in the traditional Roman manner, taught him rhetoric and law, philosophy and military strategy, as if these subjects still had practical application in governing a Roman province. They instructed him in the proper forms of imperial correspondence, the ceremonial protocols of Roman administration, the complex legal frameworks that had once regulated the lives of millions of Roman citizens. But outside the windows of his schoolroom, a different kind of education was taking place. Frankish warriors rode through the countryside, governing according to their own customs and speaking their own languages. Gothic merchants conducted business according to laws that had never been codified in Rome. Christian bishops exercised authority that derived from sources the old Roman jurists had never contemplated. When Aegidius died in 464, young Syagrius inherited not just a territory, but a question. What did it mean to be Roman when Rome itself had lost interest in you? The domain he governed was substantial, but precarious, a region centered on Soissons that extended roughly from the Seine to the Somme, encompassing perhaps 20 cities that still maintained some semblance of Roman urban life. The population was mixed. Descendants of Roman colonists, Romanized Gallic families, Germanic settlers who had been granted land in exchange for military service, and a growing number of refugees from territories that had fallen under more aggressive barbarian control. Syagrius chose to embrace his Roman identity with a thoroughness that bordered on the theatrical. He maintained a court that operated according to classical protocols, issued edicts written in formal Latin, conducted diplomatic correspondence as if he were the legitimate representative of an empire that still spanned from Britain to Mesopotamia. His palace in Soissons became a kind of living museum of Roman governmental practice. Visitors would find ceremonial guards wearing traditional Roman military dress, Administrative offices where clerks copied documents using the standardized formats developed centuries earlier in Rome, and reception halls decorated with mosaics, celebrating imperial victories that had occurred when the empire was still a unified and expanding force. Yet this dedication to Roman forms was not mere nostalgia or stubborn pride. Syagrius understood, perhaps better than anyone, that these ceremonial traditions served practical purposes in a world that had lost most of its other sources of legitimacy and continuity. The elaborate protocols of Roman administration provided a framework for governance that transcended tribal loyalties and personal relationships. The legal traditions of Rome offered tools for resolving disputes that could not be settled by force alone. In the great hall of his palace, Syagrius would hold court in a manner that consciously echoed the practices of emperors he had never met and whose authority he could no longer invoke with confidence. Petitioners would approach according to ancient protocols, presenting their cases in Latin, receiving judgments that cited legal precedents established in a Rome that seemed increasingly distant and irrelevant. But the irony of his position was not lost on him. He was maintaining Roman traditions in a world that was rapidly forgetting why those traditions had mattered in the first place. His subjects included people who had never seen Rome, whose grandparents had spoken languages that predated the Roman conquest, whose daily lives were shaped more by local customs than by imperial edicts. The correspondence that survives from his court reveals a man attempting to maintain diplomatic relationships with powers that barely acknowledged his existence. He exchanged letters with the imperial court in Constantinople, offering military assistance against common enemies and requesting recognition of his authority. But these letters often went unanswered, and when responses did arrive, they carried the tone of polite indifference rather than genuine partnership. His relationship with the Gothic kingdoms to the south was more complex and practical. These rulers, many of whom had received Roman educations and understood the value of Roman administrative techniques, often treated Syagrius as a useful ally rather than a legitimate representative of imperial authority. They would negotiate treaties with him, exchange hostages, coordinate military campaigns, but always with the understanding that they were dealing with a local potentate rather than a representative of Rome. The Frankish kingdoms to the east presented a different kind of challenge. Their young king Clovis was ambitious, intelligent, and utterly uninterested in the elaborate diplomatic courtesies that Syagrius valued so highly. For Clovis, Syagrius represented an obstacle to Frankish expansion rather than a legitimate ruler deserving of respect. As the years passed, Syagrius found himself presiding over a gradual transformation that he was powerless to prevent or direct. The cities under his control slowly adapted to post-Roman realities. Local bishops assumed responsibilities that had once belonged to imperial administrators. Merchants developed trade relationships that bypassed traditional Roman commercial networks. Military commanders recruited soldiers who fought according to tribal traditions rather than Roman tactical doctrine. Yet through all of this change, Syagrius maintained his role as the guardian of Roman memory. He sponsored the copying of classical texts, supported schools that taught traditional Latin literature, and commissioned public works that followed architectural principles established during the height of imperial power. His court became a refuge for scholars and artists who shared his commitment to preserving Roman culture in a world that seemed increasingly indifferent to its value. The end, when it came, was swift but not entirely unexpected. In 486, Clovis decided that the time had come to eliminate the last independent Roman authority in northern Gaul. His armies surrounded Soissons after a brief campaign that demonstrated both the military weakness of Syagrius's position and the political isolation that had made such weakness inevitable. The battle itself was probably over quickly. Syagrius's forces, though trained in Roman tactics and equipped with Roman weapons, were vastly outnumbered and had been cut off from potential allies by years of diplomatic neglect and political miscalculation. Contemporary sources suggest that the city fell after only token resistance. But what happened next reveals something important about the man and the world he inhabited. Rather than surrendering immediately or negotiating terms with Clovis, Syagrius fled south to the court of the Visigothic king Alaric II. Seeking refuge with a barbarian ruler who had once acknowledged his authority as a fellow heir to Roman tradition, this flight represents more than simple political calculation. It demonstrates Syagrius's continued faith in the possibility of Roman continuity. His belief that the network of relationships and obligations that had once bound the Roman world together might still provide protection for someone who had served as its faithful guardian. But the world had changed more than he realized. Alaric, faced with pressure from Clovis and concerned about his own political position, made the decision that sealed Syagrius's fate, rather than offering the sanctuary that Roman diplomatic tradition would have demanded. He handed his former ally over to the Frankish king. The execution that followed was carried out quietly, without ceremony or public acknowledgement. Clovis, having achieved his political objective, saw no value in creating a martyr or allowing Syagrius to become a symbol of Roman resistance. The last man to call himself a Roman ruler in Gaul simply disappeared from the historical record. His death noted in brief entries in monastic chronicles that treated it as a minor incident in the larger story of Frankish expansion. But perhaps the real tragedy of Syagrius's story lies not in his death, but in the quiet extinction of the world he had tried so desperately to preserve. Within a generation of his execution, the administrative systems he had maintained were replaced by Frankish governmental structures. The legal traditions he had upheld were superseded by Germanic customary law. The cultural institutions he had supported either disappeared entirely or were transformed beyond recognition. The palace at Soissons, where he had held court, became a Frankish royal residence. Its Roman decorations gradually removed or painted over. Ceremonial chambers converted to serve new purposes according to new protocols. The libraries he had maintained were either scattered or incorporated into monastic collections where their contents were valued more for their religious than their political or cultural significance. Yet something of what Syagrius represented did survive, though in forms he might not have recognized or appreciated. The Latin language he had used for official correspondence evolved into the vernacular tongues that would become French. The administrative techniques he had preserved were adapted and modified to serve medieval governmental needs. The legal principles he had upheld were incorporated into the canonical and secular law codes that would govern European society for centuries to come. In the monasteries that rose throughout the former Roman territories, monks who had never heard of Syagrius copied and preserved texts that embodied the classical learning he had tried to maintain. In the cathedral schools that replaced Roman educational institutions, teachers transmitted knowledge that derived ultimately from the same sources that had shaped his own understanding of governance and culture. Perhaps most importantly, the very idea of legitimate governmental authority that Syagrius had embodied the notion that rulers should be bound by law, that administration should be conducted according to rational principles, that political power should serve broader cultural and social purposes. These concepts survived the fall of the particular institutions through which he had tried to express them. The irony is profound. Syagrius failed completely in his immediate objective of preserving Roman political authority in Gaul. Yet the values and principles he represented proved to be more durable than the military and diplomatic structures through which he had attempted to defend them. Tonight, as we drift towards sleep, we might reflect on the peculiar courage required to maintain faith in ideals that the world seems determined to abandon. Syagrius spent his entire adult life defending institutions that were already obsolete, upholding traditions that were rapidly losing their relevance, and maintaining diplomatic relationships with powers that barely acknowledged his existence. Yet in doing so, he performed a kind of cultural service that transcended immediate political calculation. He preserved for one more generation access to ways of thinking and governing that might otherwise have been lost entirely, he maintained, against overwhelming odds. The possibility that Roman civilization might be something more than a military and administrative system that it might represent, enduring human values worthy of preservation even after its practical foundations had disappeared. In the end, perhaps that is enough. Perhaps the true measure of a life is not its immediate success in achieving practical objectives, but its contribution to the longer process by which human wisdom and achievement are transmitted across the boundaries that separate one historical era from another. The last light fades from the windows of Soissons, and Syagrius takes his place among the quiet guardians of memory, the faithful keepers of traditions they could not save but would not abandon. A journey through silent streets and forgotten rooms. As the darkness deepens around us tonight, let us walk together through the hushed corridors of time, where archaeologists with patient brushes and careful measuring tools have uncovered the intimate secrets of abandonment. Here, in the layers of accumulated earth and the patterns of fallen stones, lies a different kind of history. Not the grand narrative of kings and battles, but the quiet story of ordinary people making extraordinary decisions to leave behind everything their ancestors had built. Picture yourself standing at dawn in what was once the Forum of Aten, in eastern Gaul. The morning mist rises from the grass that grows between marble slabs, and your footsteps echo strangely in the vast open space where Roman citizens once gathered to conduct business, hear announcements, and participate in the civic life that defined their identity. The silence here is not empty, it's layered, like sediment, with the accumulated weight of centuries of human absence. But what the archaeologists have discovered in places like this challenges our simple assumptions about collapse and abandonment. These cities didn't die suddenly like Pompeii under volcanic ash. They faded gradually, room by room, street by street, as their inhabitants made thousands of individual decisions that collectively transformed the urban landscape of the late Roman world. In the residential districts of abandoned Roman cities across Gaul, Britain, and the Rhineland, excavations reveal a curious pattern. Houses that were built to accommodate extended families living in the Roman style with central courtyards, separate rooms for different functions, elaborate heating systems, and decorative elements that proclaimed their owners' participation in imperial culture show, signs of gradual adaptation to new ways of living. The archaeological evidence speaks in whispers rather than declarations. In one villa outside the walls of Trier, excavators found that the elaborate heating system had been deliberately dismantled, its bronze fittings carefully removed, probably to be sold or repurposed elsewhere. But the dismantling was done with care, suggesting that the process was planned rather than hasty. Someone took the time to preserve what had value while abandoning what had become unnecessarily complex. In the same villa, the rooms that had once served as winter dining chambers were converted to storage spaces, their walls modified to support large ceramic containers for grain and oil. The mosaics on the floors were not destroyed, but simply covered with practical layers of packed earth that would protect them while serving new functional needs. It's as if the inhabitants were hedging their bets, adapting to new circumstances, while preserving the possibility of return to older ways of living. But perhaps the most haunting discoveries come from the public bathhouses that were once the social and cultural heart of Roman urban life. These magnificent complexes, with their sophisticated engineering and elaborate social rituals, represent everything that made Roman cities distinctive in the ancient world. Yet the archaeological evidence of their abandonment tells a story that is both heartbreaking and mysteriously beautiful. In the Great Baths of Wroxeter, in what is now England, archaeologists have traced a process of abandonment that spans several generations. The massive bronze pipes that once carried heated water through the complex were systematically removed, but not all at once. The pattern of removals suggests that different sections of the baths continued to function even as others were being stripped of their valuable components. The caldarium, the hot bathing room that represented the technological pinnacle of Roman heating engineering, shows evidence of being converted to other uses before being completely abandoned. Layers of ash and debris indicate that it may have served as a metalworking shop for a time, its residual heat being used for practical rather than recreational purposes. Later still, it appears to have housed families with simple cooking hearths, built into spaces that had once accommodated the sophisticated hydraulic systems that heated the baths. But what happened to the communities that had once gathered in these spaces? The archaeological record provides tantalizing clues, but no definitive answers. In some cases, we find evidence of planned relocation houses that were systematically emptied of their portable goods, their doors carefully secured, their valuable architectural elements removed for use elsewhere. These departures seem to have been organized, communal decisions rather than panicked flights. In other cases, the evidence suggests a more gradual process of abandonment. Families appear to have consolidated into smaller spaces within their houses, abandoning rooms that had become too expensive to heat or maintain. Gardens that had been carefully maintained were allowed to grow wild, though fruit trees continued to be harvested. Decorative elements were gradually sold or traded away, while functional items remained in use until they wore out and could not be replaced. The city of Verulamium in Roman Britain provides one of the most detailed archaeological records of urban abandonment. Here, Excavations have revealed a process that unfolded over more than a century. From the late 4th century, well into the 6th century. The Forum, that great symbol of Roman civic life, was not suddenly abandoned, but gradually converted to new uses. The Basilica, where Roman magistrates had once dispensed imperial justice, shows evidence of being used as a covered market for a time, its marble columns serving as supports for temporary wooden stalls. Later, it appears to have been partially demolished, stone being carefully removed for use in building projects elsewhere. But the demolition was selective walls that could serve new functions were left standing. While decorative elements that required maintenance were systematically removed, the most poignant discoveries come from the residential areas of these abandoned cities. In house after house, archaeologists find evidence of lives interrupted but not destroyed. A child's toy, a small wooden horse with leather reins found, buried beneath the threshold of a house that was sealed from the inside. A cache of silver coins hidden in a wall cavity, never retrieved by their owner. A partially completed piece of embroidery, its needles still holding threads that have survived 15 centuries. These objects speak to us across the centuries with an intimacy that formal historical records cannot match. They suggest that the people who left these cities expected to return, or at least hoped they might. The careful sealing of houses, the hiding of valuables, the abandonment of personal items that could not easily be transported. All of this points to departures that were seen as temporary, even if they proved to be permanent. But perhaps the most mysterious aspect of these archaeological discoveries is what they tell us about the decision-making process that led to abandonment. The physical evidence suggests that these were not crisis-driven evacuations, but gradual. It's considered relocations that unfolded over decades or even generations. In the city of Silchester, in southern Britain, archaeologists have found evidence of a remarkable experiment in urban transformation. Rather than completely abandoning the Roman urban layout, the inhabitants appear to have attempted to adapt it to new social and economic realities. Streets were narrowed to create more private space. Public buildings were divided into smaller units that could serve as workshops or residences. The Forum was gradually converted into a kind of covered market that functioned according to new economic principles. This experiment seems to have continued for several generations before being ultimately abandoned. The layers of occupation show repeated attempts to maintain urban life in modified forms, each adaptation representing a compromise between Roman urban traditions and the practical demands of a changing world. But why did these experiments ultimately fail? The archaeological evidence points to several interlocking factors that made traditional Roman urban life increasingly difficult to maintain. The sophisticated infrastructure that made Roman cities function, the aqueducts, sewage systems, road networks, and administrative structures, required constant maintenance and coordinated management that became increasingly difficult to sustain as imperial support systems broke down. The heating systems that made Roman houses comfortable during winter months required not just fuel, but also skilled technicians who understood their operation and maintenance. As trade networks that supplied fuel became unreliable, and as the knowledge needed to maintain complex systems was lost, these technological marvels became expensive burdens rather than convenient amenities. The economic systems that had supported urban life, the networks of trade and taxation that brought food and raw materials into the cities, while providing markets for urban products, were disrupted by political instability, military conflict, and changing patterns of settlement and production. Cities that had thrived as administrative and commercial centers found themselves isolated from the networks that had given them purpose and prosperity. Yet the archaeological record also reveals something unexpected. Evidence of innovation and adaptation that challenges our assumptions about the period following Roman withdrawal. In some abandoned Roman cities, excavators have found evidence of new kinds of economic activity that developed in the spaces left vacant by the departure of Roman institutions. At the site of the Roman city of Callava Attributum, now known as Silchester, archaeologists discovered evidence of extensive metalworking activities that took place in buildings that had once served other purposes. The techniques being used were sophisticated, though different from Roman methods, suggesting that new populations with different technological traditions had moved into the abandoned urban spaces and found ways to make them productive again. These new inhabitants seem to have had little interest in maintaining the elaborate decorative elements that had characterized Roman urban life, but they were quite capable of adapting Roman architectural and engineering innovations to serve their own needs. Hypocaust heating systems were modified to serve metalworking forges. Aqueduct channels were redirected to power mills. Marble columns were repurposed as structural elements in buildings designed according to very different architectural principles. The religious landscape of these abandoned cities provides another layer of archaeological mystery. Christian churches built during the late Roman period show evidence of continued use and maintenance long after the surrounding urban infrastructure had been abandoned. These buildings served as focal points for communities that had restructured themselves around new social and economic principles, while maintaining some connection to the urban sites that had once defined Roman civilization. In some cases, these churches became the seeds of new settlements that bore little resemblance to the Roman cities they had replaced. The population that had once been dispersed throughout the urban area concentrated around these religious centers, creating new patterns of settlement that were more defensible and required less infrastructure to maintain. The cemetery evidence from these sites provides perhaps the most intimate glimpse into the lives of the people who lived through these transformations. Burial practices changed gradually, reflecting new cultural influences and religious beliefs, but also new economic realities. The elaborate grave goods that had characterized wealthy Roman burials gave way to simpler practices that reflected both changing beliefs about the afterlife and the reduced availability of luxury items. But even in these simplified burials, archaeologists find evidence of continuity alongside change. Roman coins continued to be used as grave goods long after they had ceased to circulate as currency. Latin inscriptions appeared on tombstones carved by craftsmen who may not have fully understood the language they were inscribing. Christian symbols were combined with decorative motifs that derived from much older, pre-Roman traditions. Perhaps most intriguingly, the skeletal remains themselves tell a story of adaptation and resilience. Isotope analysis of teeth and bones reveals changing dietary patterns that suggest new food sources and altered trade relationships. But it also shows that nutrition levels remained relatively stable, suggesting that the communities that lived through these transformations found effective ways to meet their basic needs, even as they abandoned the complex urban systems their ancestors had created. The agricultural landscapes surrounding these abandoned cities provide another perspective on the transformation process. Field systems that had been designed to supply urban markets were gradually modified to serve new patterns of settlement and consumption. Villa estates that had once produced cash crops for export were converted to more subsistence-oriented agriculture that could support smaller, more localized populations. But this agricultural transformation was not simply a matter of economic decline. Archaeological evidence suggests that some of these modified agricultural systems were actually more sustainable and productive than their Roman predecessors, at least under the changed conditions of the post-Roman world. New crops were introduced, new techniques were developed, and new relationships between agricultural producers and consumers were established. The watermill sites associated with these abandoned cities provide particularly fascinating insights into technological continuity and innovation. Roman water-powered mills continued to operate in many areas long after the cities they had served were abandoned, but they were often modified and improved by their new operators. The archaeological evidence suggests that post-Roman communities not only maintained Roman milling technology, but actually enhanced it in some cases. These discoveries challenge simplistic narratives about the fall of Roman civilization. What the archaeological record reveals is not collapse, but transformation, a complex process of adaptation and innovation that involved abandoning some aspects of Roman urban life while preserving and developing others. The pottery evidence from these sites tells a similar story. Roman-style ceramics continued to be produced and used for generations after the abandonment of Roman political and administrative structures, but they were gradually modified to serve new functional needs and aesthetic preferences. New decorative styles emerged that combined Roman techniques with influences from other cultural traditions. Most remarkably, some of these post-Roman pottery traditions appear to have been technically superior to their Roman predecessors, at least for certain purposes. The loss of Roman institutional structures freed local craftsmen to experiment with new techniques and respond more directly to local needs and preferences. As we walk through these archaeological landscapes in our imagination, we begin to understand that the story of Roman urban abandonment is not really a story about failure or decline, It's a story about adaptation, about human communities making complex decisions about how to live in a changing world. The people who gradually abandoned these cities were not fleeing from catastrophe. They were making rational choices about how to organize their lives in response to changing circumstances. They were preserving what still had value while discarding what had become burdensome or impossible to maintain. The silence that archaeologists encounter in these ruins is not the silence of death, but the silence of transformation. It's the quiet that follows when one way of life has ended and another has not yet found its voice. It's the pause between breaths in the long conversation between human communities and the landscapes they inhabit. Tonight, as we prepare for sleep, we might reflect on the courage required to make these kinds of fundamental changes. The people who lived through the transformation of the Roman world had to reimagine everything: how to organize their communities, how to make their living, how to understand their place in history, how to pass meaningful traditions onto their children. They had to learn to find beauty and meaning in simpler ways of living, to create new forms of community solidarity, to develop new relationships with the natural world around them. They had to become pioneers of a new kind of civilization, while remaining faithful to the valuable elements of the old one. The archaeological record suggests that they largely succeeded in this enormous task. The communities that emerged from the transformation of the Roman world were not diminished copies of what had come before, but new forms of human organization that proved remarkably durable and creative. The grass grows now between the marble slabs of the Forum. The morning mist rises from foundations that once supported the confident architecture of empire. But in that mist, if we listen carefully, we can still hear the quiet conversations of people learning to live differently, to build differently, to hope differently. Their whispers reach us across 15 centuries, carrying lessons about resilience and adaptation that remain relevant to our own times of transformation and uncertainty. These artistic achievements were not merely decorative but served important, functional purposes within the broader project of cultural transmission and transformation that characterized the post-Roman world. Beautiful books encouraged literacy and learning. Elaborate church decorations provided visual instruction for populations that were largely illiterate. Ceremonial objects enhanced the authority and effectiveness of religious rituals that served to bind diverse communities together. As we near the end of our quiet journey through the night, we might reflect on the remarkable achievement represented. By this transformation of elite culture in the post-Roman world, the bishops and abbots who inherited the ruins of Roman urban civilization did not simply preserve what they had received. It created something new: institutional forms that combined the best elements of classical culture with Christian spiritual insight and practical adaptations to changed historical circumstances. Their achievement was not without costs and contradictions. The Christian Church's accumulation of temporal authority sometimes corrupted its spiritual mission. The preservation of classical learning within religious institutions sometimes led to the exclusion of secular voices from intellectual discourse. The Church's role as an intermediary between rulers and subjects sometimes reinforced social inequalities that Christianity, in theory, challenged. But despite these limitations, the bishops of the post-Roman world succeeded in maintaining forms of civilized life through one of the most difficult transition periods in European history. They preserved literacy and learning during centuries when secular institutions were too weak or unstable to perform these functions. They created new forms of social organization that transcended tribal and ethnic divisions. They maintained economic and cultural networks that prevented the complete fragmentation of the former Roman world. Most importantly, perhaps, they demonstrated that civilized life did not depend on the specific institutional forms that had characterized the Roman Empire. They showed that the values that had made Roman civilization valuable: respect for law, commitment to learning, concern for the common good, appreciation for beauty and craftsmanship, could be preserved and transmitted through very different institutional arrangements. As the first light of dawn approaches, bringing an end to our nocturnal journey through history, we might find comfort in this lesson. The specific forms that civilization takes may change dramatically from one era to another, but the human capacity to create meaning, beauty, and community remains constant. The bishops who built new forms of authority from the marble ruins of Roman temples were participating in the same fundamental human activity that continues in every generation: the patient work of constructing institutions that serve human needs and preserve human values. Their marble churches and illuminated manuscripts, their schools and scriptoriums, their courts and charitable institutions, all represent variations on the eternal human theme of building. Something durable and beautiful from whatever materials are available. In their quiet transformation of the post-Roman world, you can find inspiration for our own efforts to preserve what is valuable while adapting to whatever changes our own era may require. The candles in the bishop's study burn low, and the night prayers are completed. Outside, the abandoned Roman Forum lies silent under the stars, but in the cathedral nearby, the work of preserving and transmitting civilization continues. One manuscript, one prayer, one act of charity at a time. And so we come to the end of our quiet journey through the fading light of the Roman world. Having walked together through the empty streets of abandoned cities, having sat beside the cooling kilns of forgotten craftsmen, having witnessed the last desperate efforts of men who called themselves Roman long after Rome had ceased to care about their existence, the darkness outside your window now is different from the darkness we've been exploring together, softer, more familiar, filled with the comfortable sounds of a world that has learned to be at peace with itself. But in that darkness, if you listen carefully, you can still hear the echoes of all the other nights we've visited, the night when Marcus the brickmaker banked his fires for the last time, the night when Syagrius sealed his final diplomatic letter, the night when the last Roman family locked their villa door and walked away into an uncertain future. What have we learned from these gentle ghosts of history? Perhaps most importantly, we've learned that the end of a world is not necessarily a catastrophe. It can be a quiet process of adaptation and transformation, a gradual recognition that old ways of living have ceased to serve human needs, patient willingness to build something new from the useful remains of something old. The Roman cities that were abandoned during the early Middle Ages were not destroyed by barbarian hordes or consumed by natural disasters. They were quietly set aside by people who had found better ways to live, more sustainable ways to organize their communities, more satisfying ways to find meaning and purpose in their daily lives. Our brickmaker Marcus represents all the ordinary people who lived through these transformations with dignity and creativity. He adapted his ancient craft to serve new needs. He maintained his family relationships and community connections, even as the larger structures of Roman society dissolved around him. He found ways to preserve what was valuable from the past, while remaining open to the possibilities of an uncertain future. His story reminds us that the real strength of any civilization lies not in its monuments or institutions, but in the daily resilience of ordinary people who know how to make useful things, who care for their families and neighbors, who maintain their skills and pass them on to the next generation, regardless of what political and social upheavals may be occurring in the larger world. Syagrius represents a different kind of courage, the courage of those who take responsibility for preserving the best elements of a fading tradition, even when that preservation seems futile. His failure to maintain Roman political authority in Gaul was complete and inevitable, but his dedication to Roman ideals of governance and culture helped ensure that those ideals would survive in transformed ways through the medieval period and beyond. His story teaches us that sometimes the most important battles are the ones that are lost, because losing them with dignity and purpose creates possibilities for others that might not otherwise exist. The manuscripts that preserved Roman law, the schools that maintained Latin literacy, the governmental practices that emphasized rational administration rather than arbitrary rule, all of these survived the fall of the Western Roman Empire because men like Syagrius believed they were worth preserving even when preservation seemed impossible. The archaeological whispers we explored in our third segment remind us that the past speaks to us not only through written records and formal histories, but also through the intimate traces of ordinary life that survive in layers of earth and fragments of pottery. The toys and coins, the modified heating systems and converted bathhouses, the carefully sealed houses and hidden caches of silver, all of these tell stories about human adaptability and hope that complement and complicate the narratives we construct from official sources. These material remains suggest that the people who lived through the transformation of the Roman world were not passive victims of historical forces beyond their control, but active agents who made thoughtful decisions about how to preserve what they valued while adapting to changed circumstances. They show us that cultural transformation can be a creative process, not just a destructive one. The bishops whose marble halls we visited in our final segment represent perhaps the most successful adaptation to post-Roman conditions. They managed to preserve the administrative skills, educational traditions, and cultural values of Roman civilization, while serving the spiritual needs of diverse communities that were learning to live according to new principles. Their achievement was not simply one of preservation, but of creative synthesis. They combined classical learning with Christian wisdom, Roman organizational skills with barbarian military traditions, urban sophistication with rural sustainability. In doing so, they created institutional forms that proved more durable than the empire that had originally shaped them. Their story suggests that the most successful responses to historical change are often those that manage to honor the past while embracing the future, that preserve essential values while remaining flexible about the specific forms through which those values are expressed. As we reflect on these interwoven stories of transformation and adaptation, we might find in them lessons that remain relevant to our own times. We too live in an era of rapid change, when institutions that once seemed permanent are being called into question, when new technologies and social arrangements are reshaping the fundamental conditions of human life. The example of the post-Roman world suggests that such periods of transformation, while often uncomfortable and sometimes frightening, can also be periods of remarkable creativity and innovation. The people who abandon old ways of living do so not because they have given up on human civilization, but because they have found better ways to realize the values that civilization is meant to serve. The Roman cities that were abandoned in the early Middle Ages were replaced not by chaos and barbarism, but by new forms of community organization that were often more sustainable, inclusive, and more responsive to human needs than the imperial systems they replaced. The villa estates that were broken up into smaller holdings provided better lives for more people. The tribal kingdoms that replaced imperial provinces often governed more justly and effectively than distant bureaucracies had done. The monasteries and cathedral schools that replaced Roman educational institutions preserved learning while making it more widely accessible. These transformations were not without costs. Much was lost that was beautiful and valuable. Many people suffered during the transition periods. The new forms of organization had their own limitations and injustices. But the overall trajectory was one of adaptation rather than decline, of creative response to changed circumstances rather than passive surrender to inevitable decay. The people who lived through these changes demonstrated remarkable resilience, ingenuity, and commitment to the values that make life worth living. Perhaps most importantly, they showed that human civilization is not dependent on any particular set of institutional arrangements or technological systems. The capacity to create beauty, to maintain learning, to organize communities, to care for the vulnerable, to preserve wisdom and pass it on to future generations. These capabilities transcend any specific historical forms and can find expression through whatever materials and opportunities happen to be available. Tonight, as you prepare to join the countless generations of human beings who have found rest and renewal in sleep, you might take comfort in this fundamental truth about human resilience. The specific challenges we face in our own era are different from those that confronted Marcus the brickmaker or Bishop Gregory of Tours, but our basic capacities for adaptation and creativity remain the same. Whatever transformations the future may bring, we can meet them with the same patient courage that allowed our ancestors to build meaningful lives from the ruins of earlier worlds. We can preserve what is valuable from our own traditions while remaining open to new possibilities. We can maintain hope and purpose even when familiar landmarks are disappearing and the future seems uncertain. The Roman cities that were abandoned 15 centuries ago have become peaceful ruins, where flowers grow between marble columns and birds nest in the capitals of forgotten temples. But the human values that those cities once housed, the commitment to learning and justice, the appreciation of beauty and craftsmanship, the desire to create communities where people can flourish together, these values live on in new forms, adapted to new circumstances, preserved and transmitted by people who understand that civilization is not a destination, but a continuous journey. As the night deepens around you and your breathing grows slower and more regular, let your mind drift back over the quiet paths we've walked together through history. Let the gentle voices of Marcus and Syagrius, of the unknown families who sealed their houses and walked away toward uncertain futures, of the bishops who built new worlds from the stones of old temples, let all these voices fade into the deeper silence that surrounds all human stories. Rest now in the knowledge that you are part of this same continuing human journey, that you carry forward in your own life and work the same essential capacities that allow civilization to survive the fall of Rome and will allow it to survive whatever challenges the future may bring. The marble halls are empty now, but they are not abandoned. They are transformed, their beauty preserved in memory, and their functions carried forward in new forms adapted to new needs. The work continues, as it always has, as it always will. The patient, essential work of creating spaces where human life can flourish, where beauty can be appreciated, where wisdom can be preserved and shared. Sleep well, knowing that you are part of this eternal human project, that your own small contributions to the preservation and transmission of civilization matter, that the future is being built, one quiet act of care and creativity at a time, by people like you who understand that the end of one world is always potentially the beginning of another, the gentle end of worlds, the quiet beginning of new ones. The endless human capacity to adapt, to preserve, to create, to hope. Let these thoughts carry you into restful sleep, where your dreams may be filled with the timeless rhythms of human resilience and the enduring promise that whatever changes may come, the most essential human values will find ways to survive and flourish. The last candle gutters and goes out. The night embraces all stories, all endings, all beginnings. Rest well, fellow traveler through time. Rest well.